Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. We are live on the Substack. I'm Manu. He's Stefan Bienkowski. This is the Klassiker weekend review show, and we'll get to the Klassiker at the tail end of the show. We're going to start with something else first, the relegation battle, which is alive and well and involves a lot of teams. So we wanted to start with that one today. But first, before we do this, Stefan, how's it going, bud? How's your weekend been?
Yeah, good. Busy. Lots of football between the Bundesliga. Also catching up on some English and Scottish football as well. It was the derby in Glasgow today, so that was exciting. My mum and dad actually came to visit me to get out of Glasgow, to get away from the football, because it's always so crazy on Derby Day in Glasgow. So there was that, which was also very exciting. I'm sure if we have any Celtic and Rangers fans who listen, they'll know what I'm talking about. Very dramatic end to the game. And yeah, just honestly, just so much football, so much to talk about, especially from the Bundesliga. So one of those weekends where I spend most of it sitting on my couch, and I'll never complain about that.
Yeah, no, it was a good weekend. I caught up with some of the MLS action too after the Klassiker. Thomas Müller with another brace, man, he's doing so well. It's great to see. But yeah, it's funny you mentioned the old firm. I have friends of mine here. They used to live in Glasgow, and they would always rent out their place and disappear for a couple of weeks. The old firm was on.
Yeah, it can get pretty nasty.
Yeah.
They always play it at like midday on like a Sunday in the hope that people won't get drunk, obviously before the game, which doesn't really work, obviously. But it, I used to live near Ibrox, and you'd go, the game would be on, and then you'd kind of go about your day, and then I'd be going out to pick up some takeaway or something, and I'd be driving near the stadium, and there'd be people just pouring out of bars like 10 hours later after the game, and you're like, oh my God, like, I mean, that's what football fans do, so fair enough, but it just shows that, like, it doesn't matter when you schedule a football game, people will drink and enjoy themselves, and yeah, that's just the way it is, I suppose.
I mean, the perfect example of that is different sport, but it's like same thing, like the hockey final was at 5 a.m. and bars just opened across Canada at 5 a.m. on the West Coast, and people still got drunk.
God, 5 a.m. Yeah. Oh, it's because it was, because that was the world, wasn't it, I suppose, yeah.
Can you imagine? Like, I didn't. I watched it in bed, but still, like, you like drunk at 5 p.m. And how do you even maintain that for the rest of the day?
Yeah. I used to have a flatmate who was crazy about tennis, and he was best friends with the guy who ran the bar across the road from our flat. And I think it was the year that Andy Murray got into Wimbledon that he convinced him to open the bar. Was it? And maybe it wasn't at Wimbledon. It must have been like the US Open or something, because they had to open the bar basically at like 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning. And he convinced them to open the bar so they could watch the tennis. And it was just like the two of them sit at the bar, and then some guy walked in with his dog who'd obviously been in the park and thought, oh, the bar's open, I'll walk in and get a pint. And in the UK, or at least in Scotland, you can't serve alcohol before 10 a.m. So the bartender then, or the bar manager then had to explain that. He's like, I know we're technically open, but I can't sell you anything. So the guy stormed off in a huff. So, yeah, there you go.
David Skelton, who came in obviously late for his chat, said, who gets drunk before noon? Sport fans. That's who.
Yeah.
Sport fans.
I think you definitely get to a certain age in your life, and it's probably exacerbated by having kids, where you realise that day drinking is probably the best strategic option, usually, and so you can end up in your bed like 8 or 9 p.m. tucked up, ready to deal with the hangover the next day.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'm not suggesting like morning drinking, although I remember when I was in Germany, I used to do carnival. It's a shame Matt's not here because he still does it, but I was quite shocked to learn that they start drinking at carnival very, very early, like 8 or 9 a.m. early, which to me was just quite disgusting, but
this is the second time I mentioned Thomas Müller on this podcast. He just did like a ranking beer thing on Instagram, and he ranked the morning breakfast beer at second.
Oh, okay. I can't say I've ever had that. Oh, right. So it's not an act. I thought you meant like an actual
like
actual
the
brand,
but with like the breakfast in Bavaria is like a thing.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I can believe that. That was actually. I mean, we're totally doing this for too long. But I was chatting to someone about this the other day. I was in Munich last weekend with my father-in-law actually, and I was discussing about one of the biggest kind of cultural shocks for me moving to Germany was watching people drink beer on the way to work.
Yeah.
Which is just something you would never get in the UK.
It's a sports drink.
Yeah, well, when you put it that way, I suppose. Yeah,
it's taxed the same way as bread. It's a staple food. Water, beer, and bread. Those are like the food staples. And milk. You can't tax those extra. All right. I think anyone who's going to join now is joined and is probably very confused why we're talking about food, beer, and getting drunk in the morning. Yeah, no. Let's start talking about the bottom half of the table. What is this? For the Indianapolis 500, people start drinking at like 6 a.m.
Yeah, Andrew says for the Indianapolis 500, people start drinking at like 6 a.m. If they even stop for the night before. The first time I went, I distinctly remember having a beer and fried chicken at a tailgate at 7:30.
Indianapolis, a massive German community, that would explain it.
Yeah, fried chicken in the morning is also something I'm not sure I could, with my constitution, would agree with right these days, but
yeah.
Who knows? I mean, once you've had a few beers in you, it doesn't really matter what time of day it is.
You just need something to soak it up. Yeah. All right. We wanted to start with the bottom of the table this week.
Oh yeah, sorry. This is the German football podcast. My apologies. Yeah.
Why we talk about drinking. You took in. There's a few games that were really important for the relegation battle. This week we watched Bremen Heidenheim, Hoffenheim St. Pauli, and I took in Stuttgart Wolfsburg today. All these games have implications at the bottom of the table. You tuned in on Saturday to Heidenheim against Bremen. My two takeaways from that result is, Stefan, that Heidenheim are probably done, and that Bremen are showing a rare sign of life. What are your thoughts on that, man?
Yeah, I think this game felt really significant to me. I was trying to decide which games to watch on Saturday, and this one stood out to me because it felt like, that kind of classic 6-pointer at the bottom of the table. And I think Bremen went into this match in pretty poor form, missing a number of players to injury. It must be worth mentioning. Some big players for them, of course, and I think everyone at Werder Bremen was more or less saying in the press leading up to that it was a must-win match. With all due respect to Heidenheim, I think the Bremen head coach more or less said, "Like, we've got a lot of respect for Heidenheim, but these are the games that we really have to win." And it was a game that kind of played out in a kind of really interesting kind of way. It was. I must admit, I think obviously any subscribers who were in the chat when 2:30 kickoffs for where I am, the early kickoffs, would have seen me kind of talking about the match and how the manner in which Werder Bremen were kind of continually kind of tripping over their own feet. They had a really good start to the game, I thought, but there was one opportunity actually which came in the 26th minute where how do I describe this? Oliver Deman runs through on goal basically in this, and he goes to get slide tackled in front of goal. I think the two Heidenheim players collide into each other, and the manner in which they bump into each other allows him to basically run through and score into an open net. But the VAR then calls it back because I think it's Romano Schmidt. Then VAR correctly, it must be said, decides that I think it was Schmidt had actually collided with the goalkeeper in that kind of stramash in the box, and it was a kind of catalogue of errors and this kind of lampoonish style of football that had me thinking that Werder Bremen were going to huff and puff, and then Heidenheim were going to find a goal from somewhere, and it was just going to go on and define the season for Werder Bremen. But luckily, they managed to find a goal. Milosevic, young striker who's, looking for form, gets a goal. Schmidt sets him up tremendously. I'll touch on Schmidt in a minute because I think he's really important. And then a pretty unfortunate on goal at the end from one of the Heidenheim players, Behrens, confirms all 3 points for for Werder Bremen. But it was a game where Bremen really took the game to Heidenheim in a kind of very positive way. I was just checking the XGs there, and by the end of the match, Heidenheim's XG was like 1.7 and Bremen's was 3.4. So they definitely created more chances. And I think throughout the match, I was kind of watching Schmidt play like a man who is clearly too good for Werder Bremen, and I think he has been for quite some time. We see every year or every season he gets linked to moves, and I think it was actually this summer he was linked with a move to Aston Villa, and the head coach Tiona obviously came out actually recently and said, he almost like criticised him, saying he's making a lot of ambitious and risky passes that get us into trouble in games, and you can understand why he is, because when you watch Werder Bremen, it is almost like, he is undoubtedly the playmaker in that team. And there's not a huge amount of kind of talent up front. I mean, don't get me wrong, they've got guys like Groh, for example, and Stay and stuff like that, and Leinen and Puertas, who are all kind of pragmatic workhorses, if you will. Milicevic is a striker who's not maybe going to be scoring like 15, 20 goals for Werder Bremen every season, at least not yet. So it really did come down to Schmidt, and he kind of huffed and puffed, and he eventually set up the goal that won Werder Bremen that game. And as you said, I think it's a game that was not only hugely important for Werder Bremen, but I think probably more or less consigned Heidenheim to potential relegation. And without maybe trying to sound too disrespectful, because I think Heidenheim have said so themselves, that trying to think of a better way of describing it, but they have really been making up the numbers this season, and it's almost like they've been waiting to be put out of their misery a little bit in the Bundesliga this season. And I know they've tried very hard, and that's not to say that they're not trying, or Frank Schmidt can't get anything out of those players, but it's felt, Manu, like Heidenheim are comfortably the worst team in the Bundesliga this season, and that's why it was so important for Werder Bremen to pick up 3 points this weekend.
Well, I think Heidenheim's problem is that 2 big Bundesliga clubs have come back up from the Zweite Bundesliga, right? Köln and Hamburg, and neither one of them, Köln maybe more than Hamburg, but neither one of them have played like a typical promoted team. They're kind of on the outside of that relegation battle. Köln, have to maybe watch it a little bit, but they look like more comfortable than teams that are already in the league, which of course then puts pressure on teams like Heidenheim, who are probably just not big enough to play in the Bundesliga long term. I think that's what we're seeing. And I think that's going to get trickier for a few other teams in the Bundesliga as other bigger teams are coming back. It looks like Schalke could be coming back. Hannover might be coming up with the 50,000 seat stadium, and that will put more pressure on smaller teams, which probably is a good thing. But, with Heidenheim, you see it. Milosevic is such an interesting player. He's on loan from Stuttgart, right? And he was basically, Stuttgart brought him back from where he was on loan in Partizan in Serbia. I think he was Partizan. I'm pretty sure he was a Partizan. And had a really good scoring rate there. And comes back. They think that he would be better off playing in the Bundesliga. They loan him out to Werder Bremen, who only thanks to Transfermarkt found out that they actually were still allowed to loan players. He was a Partizan, so I double checked that. And has since scored 3 goals in 8 Bundesliga games. And when you actually look at his minutes played, because he hasn't always started and played the full amount, he's now scored a goal every 100 minutes. And I think this was probably his best performance in a Werder shirt yet. He missed a couple big chances, sure, but he scores this. He's building some chemistry with Romano Schmid. He's, in my eyes, doing more for Werder Bremen now than Boniface did when he was briefly on loan there. I think technically Boniface is back at Leverkusen now that he's operated, right? I think that loan was terminated. But he could be a really important player for them down the stretch as well, and he shows it here. I mean, to be honest with you, Stefan, I think that was a must-win game for Werder Bremen to get themselves to give themselves the 3 points, especially considering what happened elsewhere too. Because this is also a weekend. When I watched this game, I tuned into Hoffenheim St. Pauli thinking, I haven't watched Hoffenheim very much this season. I really want to see what's going on there. And sorry, Hoffenheim fans, but it turns out that the visiting team actually got 3 points. But, St. Pauli beat Hoffenheim 1-0, which is a result I don't think any saw coming. But that means St. Pauli is now out of the relegation zone. And if Bremen had lost that game, they'd be in even more trouble.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the Hoffenheim game is probably the other one I was tempted to maybe watch the weekend, and then opted to watch Bremen instead, because I have taken a kind of interest in Bremen for a lot of the season, to be perfectly honest with you. But yeah, I mean, St. Pauli now 3 wins in the last 4 games, kind of doing enough to kind of pull themselves maybe out of that relegation zone. I mean, I do kind of poor Werder Bremen must have been kind of thinking, they did so well to pick up what was the necessary 3 points, and then they kind of go back into the locker room, they all turn their phones on and take a look at the scores and see that St. Pauli's picked up points, Mainz have taken a point against Leverkusen. Gladbach have beaten Union Berlin, and suddenly the 3 points don't really quite add up to what they maybe hoped it would do. But I think for Bremen alone, it's just proof of concept, really, to be honest, at this point. They've obviously been waiting for some form to kind of hit for a long time now. They're maybe kind of beginning to kind of turn the page a little bit at home. They've only lost 2 of the last 5 games in that regard, but it's the first win in 5 games. So, in fact, it's the first win in a while, actually. So it really was quite important for them. And I thought they played relatively well, to be honest with you. So it's a good club. It's got a lot of good young players there, I think. You mentioned Milosevic. They've got Backhouse as well, who I think is a great young goalkeeper. Koulibaly, obviously, in defence. Kovic is another one who's a young player who's coming through, who hasn't really broken just yet, but is getting minutes off the bench. So, there's a lot going on there. And, I mean, I'd like to see them stay up for sure, but it depends, see whether they can kind of build on this at all, to be honest.
Werder need to stay up. It's one of the big clubs in German football. A huge stadium, massive fan scene. I think it'd be a real shame if they went down. And even if it takes relegation playoffs, which it might take that, right? It might take a relegation playoff to stay in the Bundesliga, but yeah, I hope that they do stay up. But yeah, we mentioned St. Pauli. I tuned in on this game, and it turned out to be a good choice because, it kind of worked for this podcast really well. And what a win. I mean, here's the XG for this match, Stefan. The XG was 2.8 for Hoffenheim to 0.78 for St. Pauli. And people might ask, like, how does St. Pauli win this? Well, they had their goalkeeper. Vasilj had a fantastic game. Kramaric with a couple of really good chances that could have won it for them. And St. Pauli, the one big chance that they had, they scored. Pereira Lages with the goal just before halftime, and that was enough. And yeah, I think these are the sort of games that if you're St. Pauli, you kind of have to. They're in the position now where they just have to claw their way to points, and that's exactly what they did there. And against a Hoffenheim team that I think exceeded expectations very much so in the Bundesliga. And as you mentioned, I think we all expected Hoffenheim to win this game. And I think the statistics sort of suggest that Hoffenheim should have won this game. But yeah, I mean, the tactical discipline and good goalkeeping kind of kept St. Pauli in this match. And it's frustrating for Hoffenheim. But you know what? I was kind of thinking about this too when I was watching this game. As good and as well Hoffenheim play at times, I really do worry about them finishing in that top 4. Right? We get to talk about St. Pauli and what that means for them in a moment, but I just can't see them have the depth and being sustainable enough playing this sort of football and fighting both in the Champions League, the Bundesliga, and the DFB Pokal next season, Stefan. I think that'd be a really tough ask.
Yeah, for sure. I think Hoffenheim have maybe kind of lost a bit of steam. I mean, I think maybe they would argue that they created enough chances in this game.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, I think the interesting thing is that Werder Bremen completely outshot St. Pauli the previous week and still left with 0 points from that game as well. So you can maybe argue whether St. Pauli are being a little lucky or if they've been just being more clinical in front of goal. I don't think they'll really care, to be honest with you. They'll be happy to take off 3 points in both games and kind of move on from them. But yeah, it's the fact. I mean, we'll definitely have to check in with Hoffenheim in a while. I do kind of wonder if this has just been a case of, and we often talk about this, but obviously that kind of Bayern result kind of hit them quite hard, and they have, and this is often the case in the Bundesliga where teams kind of put in a solid performance against Bayern, or they're in a good run of form, they come up against Bayern, and then they kind of begin to really waver, and that's kind of what we've seen from Hoffenheim for the last kind of couple of weeks. But yeah, fair play to St. Pauli though. I mean, I was just kind of checking there, and they are picking up points. I mean, I know obviously Hoffenheim aren't at the bottom of the table, but if you kind of look at the points that they've been picking up this season, against teams around them at the bottom, I think this is maybe something that's maybe goes back to what I was mentioned about the result they picked up against Werder Bremen the previous week. But if you look at what the points they've been picking up against teams at the bottom half of the table, they've beaten Heidenheim at home, they've beaten Werder Bremen at home, they got draws away to Mainz and Cologne, they drew at home to Haas-Fahl and beat Haas-Fahl away. And curiously, they still have to play Wolfsburg at home, Mainz at home, and Cologne at home. And typically speaking, St. Pauli have been better at home in front of their own fans in the Reeperbahn. So you would think that those head-to-heads at the bottom half of the table should do St. Pauli quite well between now and the end of the season. And I know that's got nothing to do with them obviously going to Hoffenheim and picking up a result there, but obviously 3 points, that's now back-to-back wins. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see if St. Pauli really can turn things around. But the problem is, man, you look at that table and you're not really quite sure who's going to kind of drop down because, as I mentioned, everyone seems to be picking up points right now, except for Wolfsburg.
Yeah, I mean, Mainz surprised us all, right, with the point. Köln lost to Augsburg, and both, Augsburg have kind of snuck up the table here, but Köln lose to Augsburg. And there's a lot of turmoil possibly awaiting there around Kwasiok and his refusal to start El Mala, right? So they're in that zone now. Wouldn't shock me if Köln change coaches and then pull it back up. But yeah, Mainz with a point, Bremen with 3 points, St. Pauli with 3 points, and then that gets us to the Sunday game. And I tuned this in because Stuttgart, man, they're so good. They're such a good team this year. It's really, really impressive watching them. I watched them in the Europa League over the 2 games against Celtic, and the second game, the return leg, they pretty much treated like a friendly because they won at Paradise 4-1, right? So that was they didn't really have to do much in the return leg. And they really turned it on today. Undaf again scores another goal. He's the second highest scorer in the Bundesliga. And I don't have the number in my head right now, but I think if Kane wouldn't have all those penalties, that he would be a lot closer to the top of the table, top of the goal scoring chart. In fact, I think I can actually get that real quick. I'll find it throughout the podcast, but yeah, there's Undaf with another goal. I think, made the point he might be the best striker in the Bundesliga at the moment in terms of form, considering where he scores his goals, right? He doesn't have the support of scoring from the spot. Leveling, 2 goals by him, right? And he's been in tremendous form as well. Both of them doing it in a World Cup year too. I think it's going to be really difficult for Julian Nagelsmann to leave out Undaf and Leveling on his squad. And yeah, I mean, Stuttgart is further cementing their place in the top 4, and Wolfsburg are now in real trouble. They're pummeling down the table. They're now in the relegation spot. And to be quite frank with you, Stefan, this looked like a match between men and boys. Stuttgart looked like an absolute top side, a team that will be playing Champions League football for the second year and second time in 3 years, third time in a row now in Europe, and coached by a head coach. And I mean, Sepp Hoeneß, I've never seen him happy, even when they demolish our opponents. This is very, very, very Pep Guardiola / Mourinho of him. It's that he just doesn't seem happy at all. He just so demanding, right, of his players and his team, and it shows. But Wolfsburg spending all this money on all these players, and I think there's a real chance that they're going down. There's now talk that they could change coaches again. Rumors surrounding Dieter Hecking. Dieter Hecking came out of retirement to try to rescue Bochum, right? And long term, that failed miserably. And now, he's one of those other guys. He's one of those guys that whenever I think like there's certain names like Friedhelm Funkel, Dieter Hecking, Bruno Labbadia, you just know clubs are lost when these names come out of the woodwork. And I really think what you saw today from Wolfsburg is just not good enough. This club is not, despite all the money spent, that's not a Bundesliga squad that you see on the field there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the words you used perfectly there was lost. And I think Wolfsburg have been lost for quite some time now. Yeah, they've got some decent players. I mean, Wolfsburg have always got decent players because they have the money to kind of, entice players to the extent. Some they kind of stumbled upon, like Amura. Some they've maybe picked up, some that they've done well with. But there's a lot of average players there. There's a lot of players, a lot of money being spent on average players. And I think more than anything else, the club just doesn't really know what it's supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. I think you can go all the way back to like Dieselgate at Volkswagen to really kind of sum up Wolfsburg. I mean, I still remember back in the day when they were ambitious and had Kevin De Bruyne and Julian Draxler and players like that. And
Dieter Hecking.
Yeah, and Dieter Hecking. I hate him. He made it work to an extent. But
it was a different time, right?
Yeah, it was a different time, yeah. But they had the players and they knew what they were doing and they had ambition. And I just think that's been completely sucked out of the club. I don't know if it's because Volkswagen have kind of turned off the taps and said, you guys aren't a priority anymore. There's obviously always been a struggle for Wolfsburg to kind of convince people to move there because it's in the middle of nowhere, with all due respect. And it doesn't have a thriving fan scene. The stadium's quite lifeless, to be honest with you. The only exciting thing about the Wolfsburg Stadium when I went was that they have a kind of novelty blimp that kind of flies around it. And it's a tough club to sell. And and the only thing Wolfsburg had going for them was that they had money, and that money meant that they had smart people there who know what they were doing. They were signing smart players, and they always had a good squad. And I think the big difference now is you look at that Wolfsburg team, it just doesn't have a good squad. There's some players there who quite good. I mean, like I said, Amura's the one that stands out to me. There are some other ones, of course, but it's a team that's still relying on some like Max Arnold to kind of pull the strings in middle of the park. And I'm just looking through that team right now. That entire defense. I mean, Moritz Jens. Sorry, I can't even say his name. The fact that he's become such a key player for them defense, I think, perfectly sums up where Wolfsburg are right now.
Right?
Yeah, he was actually useless at Celtic, and he's been. And to be fair, he's been much. I mean, I know he's gone on to become an important player for Wolfsburg, but I think that says more about Wolfsburg than him himself, in the sense that things haven't really worked out there. You look at that team, and you've got guys like Gerhardt, Christian Eriksen, Lovro Meyer, Patrick Wimmer. There's a lot of kind of players that could have been something that have just kind of, Jesper Lindstrom as well. It's like a bargain basement for has-beens or players that could have become something and never really did. And I feel sorry for like Amura, and they've obviously got a great young player in Pasanovic, who I wrote a piece about a while ago. The young striker who they picked up from Bayern. Yeah. he's a top talent, and I think he'll go on to do well. And I think Amura will probably go on to do well as well, but there's just not enough there, Manu. And I think the really interesting thing about Wolfsburg is that, we talked about Heidenheim recently a moment ago there and talked about how they've struggled because the big clubs have kind of returned to the league. And I think Wolfsburg have as well, to be honest.
Yeah.
If Wolfsburg were still a club that spent money like a top four side, and not just on transfer fees, but on wages, and had the kind of managers and sporting directors, etc., who could run a tight ship, then fair enough. But I think budget-wise and ambition-wise, they've kind of dropped down to like mid-table at best. And I think the really kind of dangerous thing in the Bundesliga right now is that mid-table is very, very tight. And when you've got your Haas-Fouls, your Freiburgs, even Mainz have kind of got their act together, Gladbach have maybe got their act together, it doesn't leave any real room for error. And Wolfsburg have been, they've been kind of floating without a paddle for a while now. So it only makes sense that if you're not good enough for a long enough period of time, you will eventually get relegated. And it feels to me like Wolfsburg are doing exactly that, because you look at the teams above them, and the only team in the league this season who's been poorer than them on a consistent basis is Heidenheim. Every other team above them, Bremen have had their moments, St. Pauli have had their moments, Mainz are in the ascendancy, FC Köln looked good in the start of the season, and okay, a bit wobbly now, but they still got stuff about them. Gladbach had a manager bounce under Polanski, Haas-Fouls are having a bounce right now. All these clubs at some point this season have shown a bit of grit and determination to stay up, and I haven't seen anything from Wolfsburg since the first match day. So I'm not surprised that they're heading for relegation.
Well, it's because there's nothing there to fight for. You know what?
Yeah.
Like their transfer policy reminds me of. Do you guys have Best Buy in the UK? I can't remember if Best Buy exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so like me and my buddy, when we went on big road trips back in the day, or we went on like our teams went on big road trips, we would go to Best Buy and look at their DVD bins. For kids who don't know what DVDs are, these are like discs that you put in. You had to watch movies on them. I know everything is available online now, so maybe not everyone knows what a DVD is. But we would just go to like the bargain bin DVDs and buy like old DVDs and like, hey, this was a great movie. And then when we turned on the movie, like, this didn't age well, did it? And that's kind of like what I feel like Wolfsburg's transfer strategy has been. They're like, oh yeah, Christian Eriksen, like, he was great, wasn't he? And then they like put him on the field, like, it really didn't age well, did it? And so like that's kind of what it reminds me of. And I think there is a reason to why it is this way. I think that fundamentally the world is changing at the moment. The car industry in Germany is changing significantly. Factories that used to employ 200,000 people to make cars are no longer required to do so. Electric cars will come to everyone at some point, and rather than 20,000 parts, they need like 5-6 parts. That's it. And that will reduce the amount of people that will work in these factories. And that also reduces the makeup of society, or changes the makeup of society, not reduces it. And that means these company teams where, Wolfsburg essentially exists as a club because it is supposed to attract people to live in Wolfsburg or stay in Wolfsburg after the factory closes. But if not that amount of people work there anymore, what's the point? And Volkswagen will always sell cars. I'm sure they will get through this transition. But I think their motivation will change because of that accordingly, right? If they no longer need these mass factories, why would you need a company team? And I think there is something to be said about that in the demise of the club. And I wonder what happens if they go down. Like, does Volkswagen just say like, do we just reduce our investment and sponsorship to just the national team and have a team in Wolfsburg that maybe is a good second Bundesliga team or worse? Do we focus on the women's team that does quite well, right? And requires at this stage far less investment. And that really makes you wonder. And like, or does Volkswagen say like, Martin Kind is no longer in Hanover. That's not far away. Do we just sponsor them? Right? And I think there's it kind of underlines the change that is happening in German society at large. If these large factories are no longer this important, do you need factory teams to attract people? And like this team, more than Bayer Leverkusen, which is surrounded by big cities, it's a very different scenario. If Bayer would have to reduce the workforce, it wouldn't matter because Köln is 20 minutes away, Düsseldorf is 20 minutes away. There'd be still a market. But Wolfsburg is literally in the middle of nowhere. Like Braunschweig and Hannover are close by, but these places have big teams. And I wonder if we're going to see, with the change of Germany's car industry and the way it employs people, if we're going to see the shift right there, right in front of our eyes. And if they go down to the Zweite Bundesliga, if that is it. And I'm speculating here, but I wonder if we're seeing this happening. Like if we're seeing societal change play out in the Bundesliga right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think any discussion over Wolfsburg and when they get relegated begins and ends with Volkswagen's, interest in the club. And I think you make a great point as to the kind of macroeconomic issues and why a company like Volkswagen not only has bigger issues right now to deal with, but even within the kind of context of German football, they've got bigger contracts. They've got bigger commitments, as you said, with the national team to contend with. So obviously Wolfsburg exists historically speaking, for the workers at that factory. But that doesn't really mean it has to be a Bundesliga club. Yeah. And I think the scary thing, if you're a Volkswagen fan, if you're a Wolfsburg fan, is that there's not going to be many people shedding a tear if overnight Wolfsburg just kind of diminishes, and becomes this kind of backwater club, or becomes this kind of like club that ends up playing in the second, third, or fourth tier of German football. And I guess to an extent it can be partly sad because we've had a lot of Wolfsburg have played a big part in modern history of German football, and obviously people can think back to all sorts of teams and title challengers and all sorts, but it'd be really interesting to see what would happen to the club if they got relegated, because it's not just like a Schalke or Haasfall or someone getting relegated who obviously will always have fan support to kind of get them back on their feet eventually. If Wolfsburg go down, there's just not a huge amount of interest in people. It's not a huge amount of interest outside of the club, or indeed from its fan base, perhaps, to kind of turn things around, I guess.
Especially in a year where Hannover might go the other direction, right? Because then you have the big city of that state, the capital of that state, back in the Bundesliga. And they have, I think, a 55,000 seat stadium. They were a World Cup host in 2006. It could really be a seismic shift that happens there. And I know there would be quite a lot of people that have to sell television contracts, Bundesliga television contracts, that wouldn't be too unhappy if the likes in Schalke, in Hannover, and maybe Kaiserslautern and so come back, and the likes of Heidenheim, Wolfsburg, and a couple other teams that are currently in the Bundesliga disappear. And that is a reality. That's an economic reality, right? And it's definitely a thing. But yeah, the relegation battle, really interesting. And I think as it stands right now, if you're Wolfsburg and rudderless and trying to bring in Dieter Hecking to rekindle the magic of 2013 where they won the DFB Pokal, good luck. I wish best of luck with that undertaking. But yeah, let's talk about the top of the table, the Klassiker. I have to almost brush my teeth after using that word. That's now just four Borussia Dortmund wins in the last 28 games between the two teams, and I'm using the last 28 games because that is that last time Borussia Dortmund have won the Bundesliga title, and is around the time the term Klassiker was brought about by people in German media. And just 4 wins in 28 games for the German Klassiker, which is, of course, what they're trying to allude to. Just to compare it, there's been 27 games between Barcelona and Real Madrid, and it's 11 wins and 10 wins, respectively, for those two big teams. That is a typical Klassiker, Stefan. I thought, and someone made this argument now, what's up, chat? It was a great game. It was a Klassiker as a match in itself. I buy that argument. I thought the last two games between those two teams were actually really highly competitive. The problem, though, is both times Bayern Munich won. And the difference at the top of the table is now 11 points again. Any kind of sort of hope, illusions, or whatever you want to call it, that we might experience a title race is now blown away. And Dan and I talked about this in one of the bonus shows, right? After Dortmund were crushed. Oh, sorry, it was Matt and I. Sorry, get our guests wrong here. We talked about it in the bonus show. Like, this effectively ends Borussia Dortmund's season.
Yeah, it does, without a doubt. I mean, obviously out the Pokal afterwards into Leverkusen in November or December. I can't remember which one it was. Obviously at the Champions League, that kind of somewhat shocking defeat to Atalanta, and now they're too far behind Bayern to challenge, but probably a little too far ahead to worry about finishing in the top four. And I actually kind of did a bit of a rant about this on social media after the Atalanta game, because I said, look, we're going to lose to Bayern in the weekend, so we can more or less chalk up this defeat, chalk up the season as done already. And obviously they did, so, that's fine. But I think from a Dortmund point of view, I mean, talking about the game itself, yeah, I think Dortmund were quite interesting in this game. Obviously, the big talking points were Bellingham dropped and Guirassy dropped, and Benzemaini, I suppose. And Kovac obviously touched on the fact that Guirassy was out because of Ramadan and the need to fast, and he obviously featured later in the game. But we saw Fabio Silva up front with Adeyemi and Maximilian Bayer either side of them, which was a very unusual starting lineup for Dortmund, especially with Sabitzer in midfield, who has kind of been in and out of the team, but I wouldn't say he's probably relied upon or stick on for starting position. But I think I've seen in our kind of group chat, and I was also saying on our subscriber chat on Substack, that I think it maybe suited Dortmund to play as the underdog in this game, even though they were at home. Kovac also likes to play very direct, counter-attacking football, long balls, diagonal balls. And I thought Silva actually played quite well with Adeyemi and Maximilian Bayer for the most part. But I think obviously it worked to an extent. And then, they get a goal from a set piece, and then Bayern eventually kind of turn the screw in the second half and go on to win the game. And, I think Kovac obviously came out after the match and kind of said, look, Bayern are a club that can go out and sign players for 70 or 80 million euros, and we're a club. And I thought his wording of it was actually quite interesting. I don't have it to hand specifically, but he says more or less along the lines of, we're a club who sign projects, and some have walked out, some haven't. And I find that quite interesting. I'm not sure it's something that he uses as an excuse. Maybe it's something that he's maybe lamenting a little bit, because, I mean, even if you just talk about that front line, Bayer, Adeyemi, and Fabio Silva, three players that probably cost less than 50 million euros between them, I'd imagine. Silva in particular is, with all the respect, I know he's done a decent job at Dortmund, but he's a Premier League reject. He's a player that got laughed at Rangers last season, and Rangers weren't particularly good at the time at all. Adeyemi's a player that continues to kind of struggle, I think, for consistency. He's a player that can't even get into the German national team at all because of that. And then Bayer, okay, great. He's done a decent job. He's probably a player for the future. I thought he did pretty well in this game, to be honest with you. But Dortmund are obviously operating on a completely different scale from Bayern here. And I think that's true, but I think you also have to maybe consider how much of that's due to harsh economic realities being true, and how much of it's just down to Dortmund choosing for that to be the case. I think obviously Dortmund don't make as much money as Bayern Munich, but they make enough money to not have a transfer budget, or they make more than enough money to the extent that the fact that Job Bellingham breaking their transfer record last summer for a pretty paltry sum of money in the grand scheme of things I think underlines the lack of money that Dortmund are prepared to invest in their squad each and every season. And after the Atalanta game, I was on social media chatting about this, and I think the conclusion I've come to is, I think at the way that the season's going to fizzle out, there'll be a lot of kind of animosity towards Kovac. I think a lot of people point to the fact that Dortmund haven't really shown up in big games per se, even though they did okay in this match. And if I'm not mistaken, they put up a decent fight against Bayern in the previous fixture. But they get knocked out by Leverkusen. Results against Leipzig haven't been fantastic. And obviously they haven't lost both games to Bayern and then knocked out of the Champions League to Atalanta after not being particularly great in the group stages either. So I think you can point to all that and say, maybe Kobel should have done better, and I do understand that point. But I do also think this squad is severely underfunded, and I think the club, which is, by the way, one of the richest clubs in the world. It might not be the richest club.
I just pulled up the statistic because I knew you were going to go there.
Well, if you've got that UEFA report that went out last week and it shows the revenue, I'm sure you can probably enlighten anyone who doesn't know this, but Dortmund are among the richest clubs in the world.
Top
and the
10.
fact that, there we go, one of the top 10 richest clubs in the world, and they behave as if they're, with all the respect, Borussia Mönchengladbach sometimes. We couldn't possibly spend more than 30 million euros on a player. Come on, give me a break. We couldn't possibly challenge Bayern. Oh, if only we could spend 70 million euros the way that Bayern can. No one's really asking Dortmund to spend 70 million euros. They maybe ask them to spend more than 20 million euros on a defender for a change. And I think that's the issue here. I think there's just a complete lack of ambition from the club because it's run by an accountant. And I think that's fundamentally the issue, and it always has been the issue for a long time at Dortmund.
Well, I think the real issue, accountants say, they run by politicians. Bayern Munich is a club run by footballers and football people. I know that's not currently the case, but always has been fundamentally. There's always been footballers at Bayern Munich. And that has not always been the case at Dortmund. They tried with Matthias Sammer to bring him in and bring more football people in. They brought in Lars Ricken now too. Someone who was very successful at Borussia Dortmund from a different era. I think I underline quite well that where Borussia Dortmund as a recent phenomena in terms of being a big club in Germany came from in the preview piece I did for the Substack, right? There was a time in the 1990s where Borussia Dortmund became very big very quickly because of UEFA money, right? And I'm talking previous to the Champions League. There was a time where you would make a lot of money by just getting really deep into UEFA Cup. And there's people now from that era that are slowly taking over. And there's more football people involved. Sebastian Kehl, Lars Ricken, and so on. And Carsten Kramer took over from Watzke. But I think there's always been a fundamental belief and understanding that this team avoided death, financial bankruptcy. And that is, for a long time, has always been an underlying issue. They remind me oftentimes, I sometimes, I have friends who always buy, I'm someone who likes to buy the most expensive thing because I know it will last. I have friends who like, oh, you're spending so much money on your wash machine. And then they buy 5 wash machines from like Samsung, while I buy like one wash machine a year, every 10 years from Miele, right? And they spend like, I had this fight recently, this is why I bring this up, but they ended up then spending twice the amount of money that I did because they went for the cheaper wash machine. Dortmund are like my friends.
There's an expression in the UK. I don't know if it's in the US, but they say buy cheap, buy it twice.
Yeah, that's it. I haven't heard that expression, but I will definitely use it in my next fight. It's that Borussia Dortmund are like that. So Bayern Munich, when they needed a top striker, they bought Harry Kane, right?
And sorry, but I had my mic muted there, but yeah, for sure, yeah, exactly.
And Borussia Dortmund will go out, and when they saw Jude Bellingham, they're like, oh, his brother is around, let's buy him. Or like, oh, there's this guy, Fabio Silva. He had like half a good season at Benfica back in the day. Let's buy him, even though he scores like 0 goals. It's like, if he doesn't score goals in his previous clubs, what makes you think that he will score goals for you now? That is not how this works. There's this scene in Moneyball, and it's also in the book, where like one of the scouts tries to tell Billy Bean is like, yeah, what is his first base percentage? And they like say the number, and he's like, oh, well, that's not very good, is it? And it's like, yeah, but he has the potential to get that good. It's like, yeah, but we're not buying potential. We're not a club that can afford to buy potential. We have to buy factual numbers. We have to buy the guy or draft the guy who has the guaranteed number. So what makes Borussia Dortmund think that a guy like Fabio Silva, who has no track record in a top 5 league of scoring goals on a consistent basis, can be your 25 goal scorer plus?
Yeah. I think fundamentally the core of this is Dortmund have maybe been a little too good at what they've done to an extent. They've been a victim of their own success off the pitch in the sense that, they've found a winning formula to make a lot of money, and that's by selling guys like Christian Pulisic, Jadon Sancho, Jude Bellingham, etc., Erling Haaland. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Yeah. And, I've talked about that. I've talked about this season in regards to Eintracht Frankfurt, maybe to an extent RB Leipzig, maybe even Stuttgart, but the way that European football is
to make up the financial gap to Bayern Munich and Dortmund. And the reason why Dortmund strategy was because they tried to make up a gap that existed at the time that was to the Bayern Munich.
Exactly. So Dortmund were basically the first ones to figure out we can develop players and sell them to Premier League for a premium. And that's how, on paper, they could make up the gap to Bayern. And since then, Frankfurt have copied that, Stuttgart have copied that, Leipzig have copied that. But along the way, I think these clubs have realised that, especially now where the demand for players is so fierce now, and so there's players in Ligue 1 who are, Liverpool signed a defender in Ligue 1, 19-year-old kid, might even be younger now, he's played like half a dozen games or something at senior level. It's got to such a point now that you don't actually have to be successful. In fact, we were discussing this at work recently, actually, in terms of doing a review of the January transfer window, and one of our colleagues made the really important point. I thought he said, clubs don't sign players anymore based on what they've done. They sign them based on their profile and what they could do. Yeah. So if you've got Premier League clubs with a huge amount of money and cash burning a hole in their pocket, and they have to go out and make a statement or sign players every summer, they're going to the Bundesliga, they're going to Frankfurt, they're going to Dortmund, they're going to Stuttgart, and they're signing these players before they've even accomplished anything now. So maybe back in the day, a player like Marco Reus or Mario Götze or Robert Lewandowski would have had to have actually won something or done something to earn a transfer fee that gave Dortmund that financial benefit of raising these players. It's now got to a point now where these players don't even have to do anything, and the club still gets paid. A good example of that is Jamie Gittins going off to Chelsea in the summer. So for a club like Dortmund, and it is the same at Frankfurt, etc., they don't actually have to succeed to still win off the pitch. And that's why we're talking about the fact that Dortmund are still in the top 10 or one of the top 10 richest clubs in terms of revenue. And I genuinely think that feeds into the entire way that the club is run, to be perfectly honest with you. There's more interest in making money than actually winning anything, because it's much easier to make money than it is to win anything in European football these days for these German clubs.
Well, you need to make the next step, right? I can understand why Frankfurt and Leipzig are not quite there yet. They're not quite there in terms of revenue, jersey sales, etc. To make that next step and become, we no longer need to sell players, now we need to keep them. Bayern Munich made that decision famously in 2008-ish, 2009, when they said, we're not going to sell Franck Ribéry to Real Madrid. And from that moment onwards, they were a top 3 club, right? Like they said, we're at the top of the food chain. We don't care who's coming. We'd rather lose someone like David Alaba on a free than selling a player. That was a conscious decision to say we're at the top of the food chain. Players don't leave Bayern Munich. At some point, if you want to become a big club, that's the decision that you have to make. And I think that is what's frustrating about where we are now in the Bundesliga table. There is no second team in Germany can do it. And yeah, the Klassiker, it was great. It was a good match. But it's just not fought on even terms yet because one of the teams hasn't quite figured out how to get on even terms. And yes, Bayern Munich will always be bigger than Borussia Dortmund. Just like Real Madrid will always be bigger than Barcelona. But that's a fact. Real Madrid are the bigger of the two clubs, right? Yet Barcelona has found a way to still challenge them on an even balance, right? The same can be said in Italy, where there's several big clubs that are not all financially even, but they all found ways to be competitive in that league. And I hope I didn't offend any Real or Barcelona fans, but just look at the financial reports. There is numbers there that indicate a financial gap between Real Madrid and Barcelona. That's a real thing.
I think, in terms of Dortmund, I think the issue is the balance. I don't think any Dortmund fans begrudge the club developing players and selling them because that's just the modern way of doing football. But there just isn't that balance there. They don't have a squad there of seasoned pros. They don't have a squad there of ambitious players that want to win titles, and they don't even have to look that far to find a template. And that was, of course, Leverkusen under Xabi Alonso, which did have exciting young players that eventually were sold for astronomical fees. But it was also a squad that had a lot of seasoned pros who were there and signed to win things. The club signed Granit Xhaka, Grimaldo, other players along those lines because they wanted to win things. And I'm just not quite sure Dortmund are really particularly interested in doing that right now. And that's why, to kind of bring this all back and maybe wrap up, because we do need to talk about Bayern before we wrap things up here. I think it's a squad that's severely underfunded. I think it's a team that's missing a lot of key players. And what'll be really interesting to see what conclusions Dortmund take from this season, and whether they go out and spend a lot of money, or whether they just basically spend the summer trying to flog, Felix Mecha to the Premier League, and then hoping they can make 50 million euros off him, and then see where they go from there. But it's concerning times for Dortmund. But we got a question in the chat. Tom asks, Nico lucky to not get a red card after his tackle on Stanisic? Curious in your thoughts. Quickly, yes, I think he was lucky to not be red carded there. But let's talk about Bayern, Manu, before we have to wrap up, because we have to congratulate them for what was a really impressive turnaround and maybe some interesting performances, I think, from some key players.
Yeah, I thought, they responded to the challenges that they faced in this match really well. Schlotterbeck takes the lead. Kane with the equalizer. Kane then, of course, gets his mandatory penalty. And that one falls on the category. Yeah, that was a penalty. Svensson then with the equalizer, right? And then Kimmich responds. And there's always a lot of chatter back and forth on Kimmich and what he brings to Bayern Munich and whether he's press resistant or not and all that sort of stuff. But in the big Klassiker matches, he always shows up, doesn't he? And that was an outstanding goal. You really got to give it to him. That was a goal under pressure that he executed really well in that half volley. That's a world-class goal. I think, right in front of all those Dortmund fans as well, and then silencing them. That's a big time performance. And yeah, I thought Bayern Munich, in a game that they were really heavily challenged, responded really well. And I think there was also, this was also an important match, considering there was no Alphonso Davies, right, in this game. There was Musiala still not 100% fit. No Manuel Neuer, which has always changed the makeup of this game. And I thought, in considering all of these things, all the adversity that they faced, this was a really big match by a lot of important players, and they came through. And in the in the most convincing fashion, I thought.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it was a game where maybe Bayern needed some of these kind of backup players to really step up, and they did. I thought Serge Gnabry played well, even though I thought Diaz and Olise maybe a bit quieter than usual. I thought Gnabry's header for Kane's goal was tremendous. Just really great kind of second striker play. I thought Jonathan Tah played really well. In a defence that was maybe a wee bit iffy at times. I thought Stanisic played well. And then obviously, as you said, they're still missing players. They're still waiting for Musiala to kind of really properly get back to form. And then obviously Kimmich, I think, was probably man of the match, maybe with the way that he kind of conducted things in the middle of the park there. So I think it was actually quite interesting, I thought, because we're used to kind of Bayern maybe kind of blitzing teams or kind of turning games on their head very quickly with the kind of speed of guys like Olise and Diaz. We've seen them just kind of turn games almost single-handedly in matches. And I thought without both of them really looking at their absolute peak, I thought it was interesting how Bayern tackled this problem. And I thought they did it pretty well. I think Dortmund kind of ran out of steam, I think, maybe in the second half when, they had to start turning to that bench. And yeah, I don't know. I just felt like there was a sense of inevitability about the game, and I don't know if that's just me being a jaded kind of Bundesliga watcher, but it felt to me like this was a game where Bayern were always going to pull something back. Daniel's, one of the subscribers, says in the chat, I think a key thing was Kane said after the match that at halftime they were down but remained perfectly calm. That was always a facet of Bayern's game, but in recent years, a bit of panic definitely could show itself in rough games. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was touching on, in the sense that when Bayern kind of ended up having to go toe to toe with teams, they end up kind of it would look quite dishevelled and chaotic, but somehow Diaz and Olise would do something, and they would kind of find a way to kind of win the game. It didn't really feel like that in this game. It felt like, as Daniel said, it felt Bayern just kind of came out in the second half. They just weren't really phased at all. Yeah. And I kind of made a joke in Blue Sky, but Joshua Kimmich must have said, "Look, guys, come on, it's Dortmund. Yeah. Chill out. Why? There's nothing to worry about here. They're obviously going to capitulate," and they did.
I think it's even more than that. There was a really interesting interview that I watched this week in the build-up of the Klassiker with Christian Dell, former Bayern Munich player. And they asked him, like, hey, why are Bayern Munich, why do they always beat Borussia Dortmund? And he's like, it doesn't matter if it's Borussia Dortmund, Juventus, Arsenal, or whoever. When we get out of the dressing room, we walk out of the dressing room knowing that we're going to win the game. That is just our attitude. When you play for Bayern Munich, you're going into every game knowing that you can win it. And in fact, you not just know that you're going to win it, you expect to win it. And that is obviously an expectation and a mindset and all that sort of thing that has been rooted in the club going back, to the 1970s, where they won 3 in a row in the European Cup. And then, of course, you had through the history, you had always players that would always kind of pass the torch to one to the next, and to ensure that always manifested itself, right? And I think that is a real thing. Harry Kane, yeah, they will be in the dressing room. It's like, yeah, we're only 1-0 down. We're going to win this in the second half. We're Bayern Munich.
It's like that Mad Men meme where Don Draper's in the lift with that guy, like the young intern, and the intern kind of turns to Don Draper and says, "I feel sorry for you." And then Don Draper turns to him and says, "I don't think about you at all." And it's just a bit like that. Like Dortmund obviously are the kind of young upstarts in Bayern are like, I don't care. And that is really how this felt.
Another team we're going to beat.
Exactly. And I mean, look, don't get me wrong, Dortmund are the second biggest club in the Bundesliga. I'm not sure they're the second best team in the Bundesliga right now, but Bayern had to go there and get some sort of result. And it's not easy to go to the Westfalenstadion, where Dortmund have been pretty strong for sure this season. So I don't think we should really downplay what was a really big win for Bayern and a great performance, especially without Musiala, without Davies, without Neuer, with a backline that's still, a little all over the place. And like I said, without really, I thought Olise or Diaz played particularly well. Just a minor thing, by the way. for the player. I thought Svensson actually did a really good job on Olise in this game, which is no easy thing. So if any Dortmund fans are looking, yeah. So I think if Dortmund fans are kind of looking for sort of any glimmers of hope, I thought Mecha actually played really well in this game. I thought Bayer played well. I thought Svensson played well, but I think look, it was. I mean, it was what it was. It was a game. It was a result we always expected it to be.
You can't win a game like that without a number 9.
Yeah. Yeah, well, a number 9 and maybe 4 or 5 other decent players, in my opinion. But
it's the other thing too. Like, I know we slightly disagree on Schlotterbeck, but Schlotterbeck I think is a really strong centre back, the same way that Upamecano is. But you know what this Dortmund team requires? They need someone like Jonathan Tah in there.
Yeah.
Like you just like a really solid world-class defender. But like not fancy, just like solid world-class defender.
Yeah.
Like someone who does all the basic things world-class.
Yeah.
Like Schlotterbeck is a world-class player, but he doesn't do the basic things world-class.
Yeah. And I think...
You know what I mean? Like...
No, for sure. And I mean, I think my issues with Schlotterbeck are probably born out of the fact that he's probably running around putting out fires every weekend for Dortmund. Whereas if he was in that Bayern defence, he'd probably have 2 or 3 guys covering him and whatnot. So I'm sure he'll go on to bigger and better things, but I do sympathise with him where most weekends he's got either Emre Can or Niklas Süle beside him, and maybe Ben's by the other side. And, I can understand if he's probably sitting there wondering, this isn't doing me any favours in the long term.
Emre Can for a while.
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, that was like, maybe this is the story that we can finish this up with. But the fact that Emre Can suffered a serious knee injury, and we all knew that game was probably over for him, and then he plays on, and it sounds like he tore his ACL in that second action and is now out at 32 for probably a year. His contract is up, etc. But I was just thinking right there and then when it happens, it's like he's obviously done. And the irresponsibility of him as the captain and the coaching staff to leave him on the field in this situation, just weeks after Mane was left on the field with an injury, and then Dortmund conceded a goal because of it, because he his hamstring literally blew in a sprint where on a goal that they had conceded. I was thinking to myself, someone just needs to pull him off. I think you could tell he was done.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I was saying to you before we recorded, he looked like he actually pulled a muscle when he lunged to make an interception in the first couple of minutes of the game. So I think I said in our group chat, when he did eventually go off, it looked to me almost like the third injury he'd picked up in that game. But yeah, I mean, look,
the ACL screaming I'm done.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's well reported that I'm no huge Emre Can fan at centre back. Obviously a great player in his day, don't get me wrong, but the fact that he's kind of still being relied upon kind of sums up the situation at Dortmund right now. They've got nothing left to play for, Manu. They've obviously top 4 by all means, but there's really no reason why someone like Reggiani, the young centre-back, shouldn't be playing every weekend. And Asio was another one who came on in this game. I thought he did well. Play the kids. That's maybe that's my concluding thought. Dortmund have nothing left to do. Play the kids. Let's have some fun. See how they go on before the end of the season.
And don't extend the contract with Emre Can, as bitter as that is. But, he's 32, ACL is gone. If you're a well-run club, this is when you say, hey, Emre, it was great. We will support you through your process. And then when you're fit, we'll help you find a new club. That would be the smart thing to do, which is why he's going to get a new contract at Borussia Dortmund. You can book that right now. On that note, we're longer today than we usually are, but I think it was worth it. And we'll be back this coming week with some extra shows. Still have to kind of map it out because there's no Champions League football or any football other than HSV Leverkusen, which is a makeup game, which actually should be a pretty fun game to watch. So maybe we'll do something around that. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Whether it was live or after the fact, we'll be back soon. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.